Hi, it's Dr. Thompson. This presentation is Incidence and Prevalence of Catastrophic Head and Cervical Spine Injuries. Our objectives are to define basic epidemiology terms, describe injury patterns in football, describe epidemiology of acute cervical and head injuries, and then at the end of the presentation there's a couple of scenarios that we're going to look at so that we can practice analyzing data in order to make evidence-based decisions. So I have the camera on. I just wanted you guys to know I was here. Hello. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it off because you don't need to watch me during this whole presentation. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at our first concept then, which is epidemiology. So the main thing about epidemiology is that you understand that that is the science of investigating the causes of health outcomes and diseases in populations. So I looked that up on the CDC website, and that's exactly what they said: health outcomes and diseases in populations. So it's the study of what diseases are present and why. Now, that relates to, or two of the big concepts in epidemiology are prevalence and incidence. So as you can see depicted here, the prevalence would be the number of cases that already exist, whereas the incidence would be the number of new cases. So you think of it as new cases coming into a particular population. A good example of prevalence would be the number of injuries among all football players last year, whereas incidence is typically expressed as a rate. So the number of concussions per athlete exposure last year. Okay, so an athlete exposure is defined as one athlete either doing a practice or a game is one athlete exposure. So if you have a 50-person team that goes out to practice 4 days, that's going to be 200 athlete exposures, and then those same 50 people compete in the game. That gets a little more tricky because you're only going to count an athlete exposure if they actually play in the game. So that might be more of like 25 players that participate then. So we're going to add 25 to our 200, and in a week we have 225 athlete exposures. And then you could add those up for the year, evaluate the number of injuries you have over that period of time, and come up with some sort of a ratio or a percentage. Okay, or a rate rather, not a rate, not a ratio. And those are important for us, again, to understand some basic terminology so that we can interpret the data that we are reading. Okay. Our sources of data then are really three that are important in athletic training. The first is NCCSIR, which is the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research. They collect data, even though their name is called Catastrophic Sport Injury Research, they collect data across all sports, and this would be data that involves serious injuries. We'll have to understand direct versus indirect injuries. That's some terms used by the NCCSIR. And again, the data is for college, high school, and youth sports. For high school sports, RIO is one of the leading sources of information on high school injuries. So RIO stands for Reporting Information Online. And then we have Datalysis, which is a private entity. It's a nonprofit that takes on a number of projects. And probably their key project is with the college population. Datalysis runs the NCAA's injury surveillance system. So that's where we get tons of data on injuries to college student athletes. Datalysis also has some projects going on with high school and youth sports. So let's exit out of here and take a look at a couple things. I want you to know these websites and know a little bit about these organizations. All right, so here is the NCCSIR site. It's hosted at UNC Chapel Hill. It's been hosted there since the mid-1960s, and it's one of the most important injury research sort of epidemiological data sites in the country. That's one of the reasons we're making such a big deal out of it. Also, I mentioned the High School RIO project. So that's run out of the University of Colorado at Denver. The principal investigator is Dawn Comstock, and you might see her name on some of the research projects that you've done, if any of them have this epidemiological type of information. And then here's the site for Datalysis, and it describes how they are a collaborative effort between the NCAA, an entity called BioCrossroads, which I'm not familiar with, and then the ACSM. So these are kind of the participating sort of sponsors of this center. And again, the center takes on different types of projects, and one of them is that NCAA system. Okay. All right. So our sources of data then are here, and we need to understand that these folks are generating annual reports that would give us prevalence and incidence of various types of injuries. Okay. So let's look more closely at NCCSIR. And in order to interpret data that they're going to put out, we need to understand their definitions. So they define a catastrophic injury as a fatality, a permanent disability, a serious injury. And they're talking about not only death, but also in terms of the serious injury. Here, I'll take you back to their site where they describe, okay, if you click here to report a sports injury, that a catastrophic injury is a fatality, an injury that results in permanent disability, a serious injury such as a fractured neck or head injury, regardless of whether the patient has a full recovery. Anything that would be like temporary or transient paralysis in the athlete, heat stroke, sickle cell associated collapse, cardiac arrest or death, commotio cordis, or severe acquired cardiac illness. So all of these should be reported to the NCCSIR. Now the way that it's reported is you would just click here and begin to fill out the form. So they do have some outreach to talk to the public about, hey, we need more information on injuries that happen in our country, because they don't have a good system for going ahead and collecting that. So this could be reported by anyone. It doesn't have to be an athletic trainer. Whereas Rio and the NCAA system, both of those are typically athletic trainers sign up to participate and report their data on a regular basis. Okay. The folks at NCCSIR also monitor media, especially to find more patients that have suffered catastrophic injury, so they get their information that way. All right, so also then NCCSIR divides their injuries into two different categories. One would be direct and the other would be indirect. Direct injury is typically something that is traumatic, resulting from participation in the fundamental skills of the sport. So a head injury that leads to sudden death. Okay, so the mechanism of injury would be suffered a concussion, didn't tell anybody, went back in the game, suffered another head injury, developed second impact syndrome, and died. Direct injury, on the other hand, is systemic or exertional, so that while playing the sport, the patient suffers a systemic failure or complication from something that was a non-fatal injury. Think about an asthma attack that goes uncorrected. The patient develops respiratory distress and then respiratory arrest and ultimately dies. Any of the cardiac conditions, sudden cardiac death, would fall into the category of an indirect injury. Okay. All right, so then let's see how this helps us to interpret some of these reports. This table right here is from the position statement that you've already read, called the acute management of the cervical spine injured athlete. Important to note that this position statement came out in 2009, and that's why the injury table is from 1982 to 2007. So this is, I just wanted to show you an example. So the question for us is, where do the most serious, where's the highest number of direct catastrophic injuries? You've now read a couple articles on this, and you know that American football has by far the most direct catastrophic injuries of any sport. So 603 at the high school level, 133 during this period here, and that far and away exceeds any of these other categories of sport. Okay, so this would be the direct, this is the number of injuries, of direct catastrophic injuries. And then in this category over here, we break it out males and females, and also this is a rate, so it's an injury rate per 100,000. Okay, so let's look at football again. The high school from 1982 to 2007, there were 603 reported direct catastrophic injuries, but the incident rate was 0.75 per 100,000. Okay, at the college level, there were only 133 direct catastrophic injuries, but the incidence rate rather is 1.89. So it's a lot higher. It's more than double the rate of the high school, the rate of injury at the high school. Okay, so we're going to have more new cases potentially. There's a higher rate at the college level than there is at the high school. So there's more cases, total cases at the high school, but there's a higher rate in the college. Okay, and that could be relevant to your understanding of what you need to cover and how you need to prioritize your care at the college level versus the high school. But also what I think the biggest thing it speaks to is that the reason that this rate is lower is because if you consider that the injuries are the numerator and the number of people participating is the denominator, in the high school level, the denominator is going to be huge. At the college level, that denominator is going to be a lot smaller. Okay, so I'm just trying to get you to think about, rates versus the number of injuries, because the rate is applied to the whole population. All right, a couple other charts for us to look at and think about interpreting this data. So this is the number of cases of quadriplegia in football from 1976 to 2001. So I want you, you have seen this table before because it's in the head down contact and spearing position statement that you've read. And I want you to be able to answer this question. 1975 and 76, we had a really high rate of quadriplegia, 32 in one year and 34 in the next. In 2001, there were only 6 cases. The trend, like something significant happened between 76 and 77. So what was it? To what can we attribute this downward trend in the number of cases of quadriplegia in football? Okay, so looking at this data will tell us some things about trends, and I'm going to hold on to that because you guys should already know the answers. I'm not going to answer it right now. At about the same time period, from 76 to 1987, let's look at the number of cervical fractures and dislocations. 110 in 1976 and down to 32 in 1987. So even though we see this spike right here in about 1983, there still is a downward trend in the number of cervical fractures and dislocations. Okay. Again, you've seen this one as well because it comes from the same position statement on head down contact and spearing and tackle football. So why is that? Okay. What happened during that time period? So in order to understand what happened at that time period, we might want to understand a little bit about the NCCSIR. That's kind of a clue. So what happened is that in 1931, the coaches started realizing that we're seeing a lot of really serious injuries in football. So the AFCA initiated the first annual survey of football fatalities. So they were only concerned about who was dying playing the sport. In 1962, kind of as a result of this effort started 30 years earlier, there were football helmet standards developed, and that resulted in 1969 in NOCSI being created. So you probably know already that NOCSI is the National Operating Committee for Safe Athletic Equipment, and they are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, they're not associated really with anything, group that sets standards for football helmets along with other equipment. Also significant is that in 1965 was when catastrophic football injuries were beginning to be tracked at UNC by Dr. Carl Blythe. In essence, that was when the NCCSIR was born. Okay. In 1981, NCCSIR switched from just looking at catastrophic football injuries to looking at surveying all the sports, and that's what they're doing at present. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this chart here then. This is actually Rio data. This comes from the high school injury surveillance. And again, looking at how to interpret this, okay, first of all, we're looking at body sites of practice and competition injuries by sport. And it's the high school sport-related injury study. So the sports that were looked at, football, soccer, basketball, wrestling, and baseball for the boys. And for the girls, soccer, volleyball, basketball, and softball. Okay. All right. So what we have to do in order to understand these injuries or the injury pattern is to say that we need to know the frequency of injury. So we had, in football, we had 231,000 injuries, 231 and change. And in competition, we had 279. Okay, so this is an estimate of the injuries. Of those injuries, so let's just look at competition. Of those injuries in competition, okay, 46.8 happened in the lower extremity, okay, and 30% happened to the upper extremity, and 17% to the head, the neck, and the face. Also 6.4 in the trunk. So that's how you would interpret this. So in a football game then, where are you going to see the most injury? Well, the most commonly injured body part is the lower extremity. However, you do see a relatively high 17%, okay, of those injuries that happen in competition happen to the head, the neck, and the face. Okay, so my point is to get you to begin to read data tables like this and make sense of them. Okay, so we're concerned in our class about head, neck, and face. So what are we saying about practice, competition, okay, and what sport has the highest rate of injury? So if you're only looking at head, neck, and face, 14%, okay, of practice injuries in football are head, neck, and face. In wrestling, head, neck, and face is injured in practice 19% of the time. So of all the injuries that happen in wrestling practice, 19% are to the head, the neck, and the face. Okay, softball. Okay, of the injuries that happen in softball practice, rather, 22% are to the head, the neck, and the face. So this would perhaps answer a question for you about where do head, neck, and face injuries occur.